Thank you. I am Manuel Orazzi. I have the pleasure to be the moderator of this meeting with Albena Janeva and Saskia Van Stein. The title of this meeting is very much in line with the issue of this Biennale of Technology, because it's utopie realizzabili, that means feasible utopias, with apparently is a contradiction in terms, but actually, as Yona Friedman, who is an architect and a philosopher, I would say, that I studied for my PhD, was a Hungarian-French author, died a few years ago. In his book, Utopie réalisables, written in French and translated in many languages, including Italian, he wrote that actually any utopia is realizable, is feasible, if only we organize the agreement among groups for the realization. In fact, for example, the city, probably the city is the first realized utopia, because has never existed, of course, and essentially all democracy, which, by the way, is a urban utopia, even if, but this will be part of the discussion later, where also you are invited to take part, probably, or according to Yona Friedman, utopia are realizable only inside small groups, inside community formed by a small group of people, because in very big groups, like big countries, utopia cannot be realized. And in fact, if we think to utopist regime, we know very well that very often utopia has become dystopia. So I would start with Albena Janeva, who is now a teacher here at the Department of Architecture in Tallinn, at Castello del Valentino, where she teaches theory of architecture. And yes, I know you have a small, short presentation with slides, so please.
Thank you. I will turn the question of utopia to change, and that's what we decided with Saskia as a provocation to the audience. How do we make change today, especially at the time of climate crisis, of pandemic emergency, which we have witnessed, and as architects and urbanists, we are confronted with the climate crisis. We very often feel powerless. We feel something has to be done, but at the same time, we are morally responsible for the transformation of the planet. So the global pandemic in particular has played out as a rehearsal of what is to come, and hinted to a future shaped by radically new engagement with the environment, with nature, with viruses, and the fate of the planet Earth. So what we have seen during the pandemic was this taste of manifestos, of utopic projections of reality. Was this appetite for manifestos was in a way revived. The pandemic triggered appetite for grand statements. We have seen the statement that the big cities are dead, the 15-minute city revival. There was a session on the 15-minute city at the Biennale as well. So we have seen this appetite of manifesto among architects and urbanists quite present. But instead of looking at this, what I was interested to see during the pandemic is what actually happens at the level of architectural practices. How architects reacted to the pandemic restrictions and how they adapted their working habits, their epistemological routines, the communication patterns, but also the technologies during the pandemic. And to understand what happened during the pandemic and how change was instigated at the level of the practice, we started investigation with 130 practices, small-scale practices. Usually, we know a lot about big practices, star architects, but we know little about the world and the realities of small-scale practices. We all know that during the pandemic, architects had to shift from face-to-face communication and immediate presence to online and distant work, as many professionals, not just architects, but for architects it's extremely important, and this led to a number of important changes. They introduced new technologies, new patterns of communication, new ways of communicating and envisioning the client and the building, and we can continue the list. So at the level of the practice, we witness a completely different reality than at the level of the discourse and the manifesto production at the urban scale. To illustrate the reality of small-scale practices, I would like to bring three very quick examples. First, architectural practices had to change entirely the way they communicate. From the pattern of design that we all used to have in the studio, when there's a direct exchange of ideas, the model and the sketch are on the table and everyone could participate. Designers had to move to online communication, where the body of the architect was limitedly present, and architects had to rely more on verbal communication, on storytelling, on telling the others what the idea is about, rather than doing and drawing together. So this appetite for verbal communication, for storytelling, for exchange of ideas was revived, and a lot of architects also began to write more rather than design, to think first rather than act and design right away. So this was a very interesting shift at the level of the practice. Second important shift was a technological shift, and as this is a Biennale of technology, it's important to see what happens at the level of small-scale practices during the pandemic. A lot of practices introduced digital tools and technologies that were introduced during the so-called first digital turn in the 1990s, and the second digital turn in the 2000s. So for instance, building information modeling is software developed that has been introduced 20 years ago in architectural practices, but not every single practice had the chance to implement it in their work. And now, during the pandemic, a lot of practices had the time to slow down, think about the technological landscape in the practice, think about what technologies they need, and they were able to introduce technologies that existed before, but were not fully implemented at the level of the practice. Including software management, storage programs, software organization programs like Asana, and many other tools. So the kind of technological developments at the level of the practice were extremely interesting to follow. We cannot talk about the digital turn, a new digital turn, but a lot of small digital developments happening at the level of small architectural practices. And the third aspect is connections. A lot of architects had to think about new ways to communicate with communities, with clients. They had to invent new formats of addressing the general public. This is an interesting example from Sydney. There were a lot of restrictions in Sydney, and architects couldn't travel to meet Aboriginal communities, and they were designing for an Aboriginal community a preschool building, and they had to find a way to be physically there, because preschool kids cannot react to an architect that would talk to them via Zoom and through the corporate kind of platform of Zoom. They had to find a way to bring the architect in the community. So what they found as a solution was to find someone who was already there in the Aboriginal community, to train him to act, dress, and behave like an architect, so basically a proxy of the architects. And this person was there representing the architectural practice from Sydney, and this was the only way for them to communicate with the Aboriginal community. So we can see to what extent architects had to be resourceful and rethink their usual methods of work, and a lot of small changes were instigated at the level of the practice. So the virus triggered this kind of inventiveness and resourcefulness at the level of technologies of practice. Moving to the other global trigger of change, the new climatic regime, we have seen in the past, I would say, 10 years, a lot of architects trying to grapple with the problem, trying to rethink cohabitation of humans and non-humans. There's some works which are quite inspirational. The work of Andres Jaque, who in his design of the Barcelona Pavilion had to think very carefully about the chemicals in the lake, the conditions that water lilies need in order to survive in this lake. So very careful attention to non-human species, to all sorts of species, animals, chemical animals, plants, but also the chemical compositions of water and air. So architects are increasingly paying more attention and also inventing new technological and material practices to adapt to this challenge at the level of the practice. Another example is, for instance, Philip Ham, climate-friendly design, and what he calls climatic architecture, where air, hot air, and humidity, cold air become the key structural elements of architectural composition, not walls and bricks, but climatic components. This, of course, leads us to rethink, all of us as educators, as students, but also as the general public, we need to rethink the language that we use to visualize climate emergency. On a daily basis, we see images that are top-down, simplistic. They use quite kind of cybernetic type of aesthetics to visualize the problems of climate change. What architects can do to help the understanding of the climate emergency is to rather produce visualizations that could grasp the gravity, the scale, and the multiplicity of the climate problems that we witness. Visualizations that will situate us within nature so that we can understand how entangled we are with this endangered species. And to conclude, I would like to bring just two examples of architects who are doing precisely this. Alexandra Arène is a landscape designer who spent a lot of time following scientists at work in the critical zone, tracing the communication between scientists, looking at different chemical cycles in the critical zone, looking at plants and animals and how they are affected by pollution and the problems of biodiversity. So she started producing visualizations, as you see, that are very different from this top-down, cybernetic, and very simplistic visualizations of nature, where nature remains very static. So here, the traditional kind of layers that we have: rocks, then the altered rocks, soil, and atmosphere, which are kind of traditionally layered in this way, are entirely inverted by Alexandra, and we have like an anamorphosis where we see that the atmosphere is right in the middle, and then the other layers follow at the end the rocks. So with this representation, which is an exact kind of an anamorphic representation of the traditional layers of the Earth, what she wants to convey is that all the pollution actually comes back to Earth, and we are in the middle of this air, which is in the center. So we are all trapped, and we cannot escape pollution. So visualizations like this, of course, based on scientific research, based on close collaboration with scientists from the critical zone, could help us to understand the gravity and the scale of the climatic problems. Another example to complete with is Design Earth, where we see also how embedded we are as human beings within this complex layers of nature. And again, we do not contemplate nature or any of the environment. The environment is not passive, but we're part of it with all the kind of activities that we engage in on a daily basis. We transform, we are within nature, and we weave a complex web of relationships with nature. So this kind of visualizations, we might even call them dramatization of the climate emergency, help us to understand to what extent new actions are needed, and to what extent also designers and architects could help dramatize and understand the gravity of the problems, as these representations are based on close research rather than simplistic representations of nature. So what does the future hold for architecture in the new climatic regime? There is a lot going on at the moment in architectural discourse and in practice. We all blame modernism as modernist extractivist practices led to the extensive use of carbon-intensive materials and extractivist methods, which all had a devastating impact on ecological balance and the communities at global scale. Thus, we all feel the pressing need to fundamentally rethink and change our working methods as architects. And of course, this has to start in practice. We need to bring public awareness of this and also at the level of pedagogy. What are the solutions? Is it, do we need to experiment with novel digital methods to explore new possibilities, to experiment with biogenetic and geogenetic materials, shifting towards site-specific solutions perhaps, rethinking the cycles of labor, just to mention some possible solutions that architects are debating at the moment. So to be better, to be able to better represent but also solve all these complex issues of the climate regime, we have to look closely, even closely, I would say, at architectural practices and what happens in architectural practices at the moment, just as we did with the pandemic example, to see how architects are reacting to restrictions and to change, and we need to have a closer look at the laboratory of the architect in the new climatic regime. What will be the technologies, what will be the technical innovations and the new material practices that will help architects to address the climate emergency. Approaching these questions with care and respect can spare us the hazards of both climate skepticism and blatant activism.
Thank you. I think I have my own...
Okay.
Yes. It's the turn of Saskia van Stein, who is the director of the Biennale of Architecture in Rotterdam, and other activities that now she's going to expose by herself.
Grazie tanto. That's where my Italian begins and ends. It's great to be here. Thank you very much to the Biennale Tecnologica, its partners, the staff, the volunteers. It's been very generous in all the hospitality, and of course also our foreign ministry and our embassy. It's always nice to know that they know I exist. That said, I thought to talk a little bit about navigating proximity and distance. So we'll talk about change, and that of course has to do with time and scale. Now, time and scale is not given to me because I have 15 minutes to present 25 years of work, so I'll go through it very fast. I'll present 5 projects and 10 provocations that are very much in line with your closing concerns and remarks. But those of you who are interested, you can send me an email. I'm very digitally connected. I'm also, besides director of the Architecture Biennale of Rotterdam, headmaster, together with Patricia Reed, of the master entitled The Critical Inquiry Lab. So that's maybe my answer to where the future could go. So research and criticality could merge. I enjoy moderating. Here you see me being grilled by Mr. Rem Koolhaas, still, of course, our most famous architect. And I have a huge passion for Walt Disney and his capacity of storytelling, both material and immaterial, because I think we need these stories. I will start with the images we see all over the globe, all over our Instagram, all over our newspapers. This is, of course, has to do with the consequence that we at the Architecture Biennale are looking at. So what are the spatial consequences and the humanitarian? So it's the smallest scale, proximity, the human, and the distance of the larger scale, and how can we negotiate these worlds? And of course, I'm sure you're all aware, but it's not only about drought or water or electricity, it's literally going to be too hot that we can't, in these regions, go out for more than 20 minutes. I am speaking from the Western condition, and particularly from the Dutch condition. That comes with particular biases. Even I try to work with or without those. But our country is, in effect, of course, also part of a very urgent question, namely, where will 6 million of the 17.5 million people go towards the German border? The projects that I chose have little hints that deal with change, and maybe how I, as a, let's say, cultural actor, operate in the field of representing architecture. Now, I would say over the span of my career, the culture has become more rooted in practice. We'll talk about that maybe a bit later on. Because the Venice Biennale has just opened, I thought I'd start with this little bunny, Vacant NL. I'm going very fast, so we all remember the Lehman crisis, of course, the financial system stagnating. But this was also the moment where this very tolerant country called the Netherlands all of a sudden became populist. So what does that mean if we start introducing the rhetoric of Holland is full of Moroccan people in this particular case? Well, in fact, we were full with empty buildings, 22% to be precise. And we are demographically on decline. So we have this pyramid going the other way around, a lot of older people and not enough young. So as a young curator, one is of course very honored to be in the Giardini. This is the Rietveld Pavilion. But it dawned on us that the Giardini back in the day was only open for 3 months per year. So that building in and of itself had been vacant for nearly 40 years by the time that we started. And that became to think, like, what does it mean that we not use these properties? So we looked at 7,000 buildings, monuments that are empty, that are state-owned, that are taken care of, maintenance, heating, insurance. And we try to ask, how can we use these 7,000 buildings differently? And these buildings, they just change their function. So that has to do with how industry changes, low wages countries and so on, the secularization. And of course, we also try to reference a little bit the low-hanging ceilings, but of course the Nolly map that I'm sure all of you are aware of. We devised an atlas of vacancy, to make a provocation. Where are these buildings? What do they look like? We made an iconic palette. How could we envision a new function for these buildings? And then artist Barbara Visser designed she visualized a network of the most crucial places and people and networks that were relating. So Vacant&Al looked at where architecture could meet ideas, and people were already doing it. This actually was quite successful because it led to, on the one hand, a lot of press, and on the other hand, it led to an educational master solely devoted to vacancy. Fast forward, project 2 out of 5. Our king mentioned we are a do democracy, so I thought, finally, we're going to do it. Civic action and emancipation, or is it just another way to introduce more austerity measurements? Back in the time, I was director of Bureau Europa. That is situated in Maastricht. You might know it's where in 1992 the Maastricht Treaty was signed to become the European Union. This is what it looked like. It was one of the first factories, in fact, in the Netherlands. I'm always impressed by, at the turn of the century, there were so many men and women working. But this is what we found. 5 hectares of just derelict green. Also because of the Lehman crisis, these ambitious projects did not come to fruition. And of course, it was such a beautiful biotope. So we introduced the temporality of the park to question, hey, citizens, what do you want to do in this park? We opened it up. We made a small shelter. We built a little arena. And people came in. They said, we want to make poetry evenings. We want to build the smallest gallery possible. We want to make food for the neighborhood. And here it was beautifully intergenerational, old and young people coming together to debate on what would be the best way to eat with the seasons. And with everybody, we gave a little bit of money. We also asked, do something for the public. So you just saw the barbecue for the neighborhood. We worked on an inner city beekeeping scheme. We sold it. We then went up for a second version that was on hydraulics because it was extremely heavy. It worked. And we had, for instance, a little mini Woodstock where people would just get together and animate this place. So 2 years ago, I was appointed as director of the Architecture Biennial. It started as an annex of the Netherlands Architecture Institute. Unfortunately, that doesn't exist anymore. But Christine Feyereis, director of Aedes Berlin, thought it would be good to look for inspiration from elsewhere. That was 20 years ago. So we orient our biennials towards research, towards events, and then once every 2 years we put things on a platform. And I did not know that we would talk about change, but it is the Biennale that the first one was about the architecture of change and how to understand time. So I don't know who picked up on, about 3 weeks ago, a clock was scientifically manufactured on strontium atoms, and that clock will be accurate for 40 billion years. Now this is something, it's like 3 times our universe. I find it so hard when we talk about proximity and distance, and then we have this clock that can look so far ahead and so far back. But the changes we need to face are of a different temporality, obviously. I say we because I always collaborate. I truly believe in collaboration. We can get to the borders of that ethically. So you're looking at Dirk Loorbach, an academic. You're looking at Lerka Trinchatska, a historian, because I thought maybe that we need more historians thinking about the future. Peter Veenstra, a landscape architect, because it begins in the roots again, and Veronique Pateo, also a historian. And we took this moment where the Club of Rome looked at the planet Earth. We all know the blue marble, this first time that we see the planet as a whole. The Club of Rome in 1972 was asked by markets, by the industrial awareness, let's say, that maybe the limits to our current way of living were already to be foresighted. So they used this napkin drawing, let me call it that, a system of systems, and computation. And I'd love to talk a little bit, if it was in fact the fact that it was predicted by computers that maybe society was not ready for it, I don't know. These were the scientists, and these were the criteria that they were looking at. Now, very shortly, it's as if it's yesterday or today. Natural resources, extraction. Food per capita, how will we feed the world? Population, ever growing. Industrial output per capita, it's on decline, at least in Western reality. Pollution, we never talk about acid rain anymore, but we have other kinds now. And it can be done, right? We closed the whole of the ozone layer. This was the booklet. I tried to look for the Italian version, but couldn't find it. And these are, of course, all the measurements we're trying to take on a planetary scale, but somehow it's getting hotter and hotter. The exhibition, I had a sort of epiphany that I thought, oh, let me find a ruin of fossil fuel. And that, in fact, became a gas holder, which, when I found the key, was very dirty and old, but we made an exhibition there showcasing 50 years of experimentation, legislation, popular culture, dealing with these questions of the changing climate. Again, the projections of the Club of Rome for 100 years. What did architecture do? And just to share one picture that is very incremental is that Carter actually already in the end of 70s put solar panels on the White House, and then Reagan came in and took them off again. So we talk about architecture that maybe has to accelerate. It's funny that you had André Jacques. This is a work of his, of course. Maybe the architect sometimes needs to be an activist, really very close to communities, very hands-on. In this case, for instance, Ooze working with the favela and a water irrigation system. And maybe we need to reconnect to ancestral thinking, not only how do we leave the planet for people after, but also which kind of technologies and technique and materials can we reuse. And I'm going to slide also this idea of start to think through designing with the more than human. We are indeed, as you rightly mentioned, part of a larger whole. In a transition arena, we talked about the X-curve. We see one system going down, another system coming up, but it's not quite there. So I would say we're actually in the middle, the chaos. So if you feel worried, it's right. You're right. And we had a lot of talks. People could place stickers where they felt they were still sitting. Educational programs, guided tours, in situ conversations, in this case in a greenhouse. Different publics, getting different publics in is extremely difficult. The protagonist one more time. Everything that you see was used, very shortly used, and each exhibition should of course end with a good, strong manifesto. I'm going to go very fast through this. The Dutch actually did not come up with an answer after Super Dutch. And what we see is the narrative not ready. So by now we are facing a lot of challenges where we had the best instrument, both policy as architectural climate ever. But we're faced now on a population of 17.5 million with 1 million houses short. How can that be? So I thought maybe I can help our minister a little bit, because our government also has compartmentalized all the different aspects that, in fact, how can they come together? So we helped him, didn't make a deep fake, we did consider, but an analogy to the COVID, we gave every architect who wanted to a test kit, And with a test kit on 4 square kilometers, they would design 10,000 dwellings. So here you see one of the kits. It had water, trees, what have you. They could choose their site. They collaborated with the office on Fridays, and that led to this marvelous inventory of 100 and good ideas for the Netherlands. This exhibition then is now traveling through all the provinces to get the conversation going. And the good thing is, if you organize something for 101 offices, that you have very large openings and people meet each other again. So this was just the first exhibition after COVID. Last project, we all know that we have to do something about our CO2 output. As it was already pointed out, we are a very pollutant practice, but also as people, for instance, the energy consumption of our data output will surpass our aviation industry globally. It's this month or next month. So, you know, from sourcing to keeping, the spike of energy is going up. So we looked, and these are images by Oos Architects. This project tries to do 2 things: generate bottom-up power and analyze top-down what is going on. So you see governance, energy tools, and climate adaptation, trying to understand a neighborhood and how the personal is in fact connected to both the local and the global. So how, again, this proximity and distance can be overcome by behavioral changes also. And the behavioral changes were analyzed by Oos, like what are people actually doing in this neighborhood of Bospolder-Tussendijke? Because the government is going for a one-size-fits-all solution. However, it would be much more beneficial if we would make acupuncture and really be very precise. Some buildings could go for solar, other could go for cold water pumps. Well, it goes too far to delve totally in it, but the energy leap, so there was local energy and participation, could then start to work and animate whole neighborhoods. This would give new energy also to this notion of citizenship. And we do this with a large community of Bospolder-Tussendijk. We started off by just baking bread. With bread come stories, with stories come togetherness. And maybe you do not see, but on the right side you see a little fire burning, and this is a mobile wooden oven that is standing in a different street every day. And this is how we actually communicate with people and start to talk through what they could do to change the climate. Mind you, this is the poorest neighborhood of Rotterdam with 174 different nationalities, and I truly believe that all these communities have different aspects they could share in order for us to leap forward. For instance, nomadic communities live with big blankets to keep all the heat in and keep each other warm. Well, it's just a simple thing. We helped this community House of the Future to keep one room warm, because there were people literally not able to afford their energy bills because of the war in Ukraine. So, finalizing with the points and the crises we are facing, don't get overwhelmed, but we have to think differently, obviously, about our financial system, because it is cracking at its core. We see now that banks, pension funds, and insurance companies are calculating the risk into the mortgages and into their pricing. This is in fact where architecture sits in the prognosis of declining professions when artificial intelligence will manifest itself. We can talk about it or not, but it is something to think through, that maybe the architecture in and of itself is ready for a renaissance. And that renaissance obviously will also pivot around technology, that is from systems of control to systems of relationality, from notions of a central to a distribution model that is decentralized, from, let's call it ego to eco, the design for the more than human. How do we relate to the bigger picture again? What if architecture is climate, or how we understand architecture as climate? What will the implications be if we want to move beyond extraction and try to understand that material flows are possibly something to negotiate. There's not a one-size-fits-all answer. But it also brings new aesthetics. For instance, this beautifully patchwork roof. It's a very old technique we are revisiting, but then again, in contemporary practice. The other example is by Jan Nauta, Rammed Earth Pavilion. This is still concrete, but what about 3D printing or CLT building with wood? This looks like a very plain and straightforward villa, but it is in fact a highly bio-based circular building that is like an eco-booster for biodiversity. The whole, it's one big insect hotel, one could say. We should start to design also with the subterranean. It's difficult maybe on the architectural scale, but I noticed that in the Dutch context we still see the under-earth or undersea as a sort of tabula rasa, but there are ecologies already living, so how can we work with that? Use surfaces, in this particular case, the rooftops are being used, one of IKEA, an older one, and in Rotterdam, my city, by Zeus. I'm not saying anything new, but I'm just hinting at directions where this renaissance could sit, and that we should be maybe looking forward to all of this instead of harnessing and harvesting fear. Old industrial sites, this is our, the top image is what it looked like, and they actually put only a skin in with fabric. So what can we learn from fashion? How does the collaborative manifest itself? I return to that. I truly believe that together we'll know a little bit more than on our own, but you need to know what you're offering to processes of belonging or commoning or maybe even rituals. This building was built by 30 families. They didn't have money, but a lot of manpower. Is it architecture? Maybe not the nicest, but I truly believe, and I'm closing with 2-3 slides now, that we need to design our design tools. So this could go from jurisdiction to knowledge sharing, alternative financial systems, and obviously restoration. These projects are restorative projects, the one of the land, and the land is actually owning itself over time. The other image on the right side is a community that built a house together, but they couldn't get funding in the Netherlands, so they had to go to Germany. I truly still believe in culture because we need new narratives. It was mentioned already. Fresh imaginaries, compelling stories, and experimentation to see where that future would go. That also comes with preparing us for different pedagogies. Literature is already out there. Here are a few things that I think will actually situate the transition of this renaissance that I mentioned. I think I will keep it at that. I was a few minutes longer than 15, but I thank you for your attention.
Yes, thank you, Saskia. Also, again, thinking about Yona Friedman, that I publish in Italian with Quadlibet Publishing House, where I work. Also, Yona Friedman, in another book, talked about the reform of the role of the architect in the 70s, because, of course, ecology came out, not came out, but there was a general realization about the ecological problem, pollution, etc. Very productive. The book you quickly showed where much of that were of the 70s, who were born in the 70s. The research said that the architect should be like a language teacher, in the sense that your complex way to involve habitants and people, not only to the architectural project, but to be aware of the complex process of extraction of materials, of the impact of human activity in energy. So in a way, you are trying to teach a new language for building, for relate, for move, etc. And of course, we know very well that the Netherlands are the most radical country in Europe, because it's the only country that culturally, there's no fear of tabula rasa like Asia. For Europe, especially Italian, tabula rasa is the greatest taboo because we have preservation. So, also politically. So, as we are at the end, of course, maybe there is space for questions by the public. Otherwise, I mean, I think that Albena Yeleva too is looking for a new language in history and theory of architecture. Maybe I can ask you quickly what you think about both, and then I invite the people to do a question.
Yeah, thank you, Saskia. This was really interesting and very similar indeed to what we are trying to do also at the level of pedagogy, at the level of practice. I would say one difference, of course, you engage much more with communities and you try to bring this awareness and try to multiply the languages to reach the communities and to talk about climate in different ways. From the blanket stories and the bread making to the kind of this sophisticated exhibit that you had on climate, visualizing the timeline, the scale, and the gravity of the problems, because obviously not every type of public will join the Biennale. So you also went out of the institution to reach those audiences. And I think this is quite interesting as a move, that you go back and forth, reaching out to those who usually would not come, and then finding different tools, different techniques of mobilizing, raising awareness, mobilizing, but also what I enjoyed in your presentation, understanding their ways to talk about these problems, their ways of articulating climate without necessarily using the climatologist terms or the scientific or the architectural kind of ways of articulating the problem. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about this. Obviously, this discourse is produced with different techniques at the level of academia and pedagogy, but what I find really kind of remarkable in your work is that you multiply the languages and the techniques, verbal and visual techniques, to reach out to different audiences, which I think also is something that we can learn from in academia and also in pedagogy.
Well, I have a few examples coming to mind, but for instance, already creating trust and in his community, one of the first things a Moroccan lady said to me, "You talk too difficult for me," literally. So I thought, okay, so how do I then move towards, this is already something like how to find common ground. But yeah, it's also to stress that we still do, for instance, I'm now thinking of what is the perfect example, but you notice that, for instance, Aisha, the lady that I was just referencing, she guided our Minister of Science, Education and Culture, what was it, 3 weeks ago, and she told him, I would have gone to a psychiatrist if I would not in this project. It's just to say that for her, it's the most logical thing to give meaning to her life again. And that's, I think, an enormous compliment. And she's not schooled, but she is schooled. She touches a wool and she say, this is a wool that needs you can make a sweater, or this is for cat. So she had tacit knowledges that I obviously don't possess. So it's to say that we also stimulate very large projects. We're now working on a mobility strategy for the city of Rotterdam for 2070. But there also we try to organize the process in a way that we start to permeate each other a bit more. Because when we see that you know, there's a lot of electoral fear in our institutions, fear everywhere actually. So how can we generate a change through something that is a bit desirable? That we don't use the narrative of you're going to lose something. No, maybe you can gain something. And there I return then to Disney. He says, imagination is the model of which reality is built. So first we need to really, you know, have these stories, have these ideas.
Tabula rasa.
Yeah.
Possibly. But I would say there is no tabula rasa, even on Mars. But
Yeah, another interesting issue is that people can, there are a lot of people who are skeptical, right? There's a climate skepticism movement, and on the other side, there are lots of people who will go in the street and protest and will embrace the kind of activist attitude. And you have decided that none of those is actually the right one, that we actually have to go, reach out to these communities, understand their language, try to articulate the problems with their own words and bring this knowledge back. Because neither activism nor climate skepticism will save us from the current climate crisis, right?
Yes, I'm afraid so. There I'll go with an anecdote. I arrived yesterday and I went to the market and bought some olives. And the gentleman offered me a bag, but I already had a bag, so I said, no, thank you. So he said, you're a climate activist. So I said, well, I came by plane, so I'm hardly a... but then I thought it was interesting that he spoke about they are trying to force the climate onto us. And my Italian was not well enough to have a proper conversation, but I think that as long as we can say they, we can other the problem, we will not... find each other, and we need everybody at least to start creating a little bit of a critical mass. You know, thinking. So Dirk Loorbach, the transition manager thinker, he specialized in mobility. Well, mobility is to go from A to B, but in fact, the car is not about mobility at all. The car is a synonym with freedom, with ownership, with showing off, right? So. Yeah. We have to really, it's a real cultural shift that if you would pay less for a shared car, in our inner city, 70% of public space would become available. We can do sports, we can make it green, we can... I'm just saying that it requires...
imagination.
Imagination.
Project, a very conservative word for architects, project, design. Are there any questions for our guest, for Saskia and Albena, by the lecturer?
It's all clear?
No. Because more
you
or
can
less...
ask it in Italian, maybe I can manage, if that's
yes, also anche in italiano, certo, se non è un problema. Abbiamo la traduttrice istantanea, quindi...
I would say that the reason I stated so much about being from the Netherlands and being in the Dutch context is that it's becoming increasingly hard also to understand locality. But I would be very much looking forward to how we could understand locality without the nostalgia that is now being introduced. And again, this rhetoric of fear. And this... to talk to the Italian context, I like walking, and I walked in a neighborhood north of Rome that's apparently now owned by Ferrero Rocher. So the farmers on that land actually don't own their land anymore, they're workers on their own land, talks back to your point of labor. The chemicals they use to have the perfect hazelnut is bad for the groundwater and bad for the people, because the cancer rise is going up in that region. And I just ask myself, what kind of tools do we have? And we have the same in Holland. I'm not trying to point, we have the same with the tulips. And it's just what kind of world are we producing when we are toxicating each other? There's no other word. And this is land that has been in the family for centuries. Are we rioting because of this? Anyway, just a thought. Sorry, sir, go ahead.
Thank you very much. This is the former rector of Politecnico di Torino. I was the rector until 1 month ago. And I'm an engineer. It's much more frequent. Always engineers have been ruling this technical university, and the honor of the rector has come to them because of simply numeric reasons. We have 4 times engineers and 1 time architects and designers. We had a professor here called Gino Bistagnino that had a similar approach to yours, systemic vision, and I was fascinated by this vision, but as an engineer, I thought that was lacking an enormous amount of information from our side. So that was the reason I started cooperating with him, and we were mates in teaching designers to develop sustainable housing and similar things. He didn't want even electricity to get into the game. I was pushing it through, and we were always quarreling, but that was part of the education we transferred to our students. So I had the pleasure to spend my PhD in Twente University, and your country is full of very good technical universities and full of similar backgrounds as mine. I wanted to know whether we can finally get different competencies together to work. What you were mentioning were fascinating things, but solar panel engineers, mobility managers, so could help to make it become reality in a more effective way. We need everything. We need also your vision, your way to communicate things and involve people to do things, move people, which is actually the motto of my rectorate was to create a humanistic engineer, a creative engineer. Because architects, designers are intrinsically building technologies around humans and communities, and they have in their education sociology, history, and so the human and social science. The big thing that we brought in the last 6 years human and social sciences in the education of engineers. So time has come, I think, especially in a country as yours, to really build, to do things multidisciplinary, not just but transdisciplinary things. And I wanted to ask you whether you have early evidence that something is happening in this direction. Because in the knowledge economy that we are facing after the crisis of Lehman Brothers and the role of universities and the friendship among different disciplines and professors that were once upon a time building their career in a vertical way is essential. So that was something that we were trying to push here, to let these different worlds come together to provide solutions. Can you react to this? Is there something in your country happening in this direction?
Well, first of all, thank you for being here. It's an honor to have you as a fellow humanist. The answer is simply yes, but it takes time. And one of the projects that I did not show, the local energy, trying to understand a whole neighborhood as one system, was actually 90% systemic thinking and engineering. Like, how can it be done? How can we connect all the different values? But then one person in the group, he was a designer, he decided actually to start a common solar panel collective. So they now own their own solar panel factory that is fully engineered, where they work with a group that actually look at which roofs can handle it. But then the profit goes back into the neighborhood. So they introduce the local economy. It's just to say that I know that also in academia, for instance, the Wageningen University, the professors are very transdisciplinary and even radicalizing a little bit. I know somebody that is working on a big palm oil project. So yes, but these things go very slow, unfortunately. And I would say that your profession is in luck in the Dutch context, because we still really believe that everything can be solved with engineering, that we can design our way out of all of this. It is indeed a sort of reset of modernity, but then with the current tools. Yeah.
Yes, if I can add something, it's again about Fiona Friedman. Utopias are realizable only in small groups. I mean, you can arrange only small groups for really communicating of professors. In fact, if we think of school, what the so-called School of Gottinga, School of Venice, wherever in university, are always been small group of people. But even the great one, the Romantics, Goethe, Schelling, there were 7 people around a magazine and frequenting themselves every day. The problem of big schools, you do not frequent. You meet once a month and then fight for position, for things, etc. The vertical thing. But you never work together. That, when it happens, they came out, I ragazzi di Via Panisperna, the genius. I mean, Oppenheimer, you all seen the movie, no? What did Oppenheimer? He didn't do the bomb. He put physically the professor like in a prison. It was not a prison because there were families and children, etc. But they were forced to live together, not only to study and work. And that's how genius, the so-called genius do not exist. Exist when you have group of people and someone is the front. I mean, Colas have thousands of people and hundreds of thinkers and talented people around for decades and so on, and Le Corbusier, etc. So we should do something about small groups, I think.
But you had Reinier de Graaf here, who actually now is reinventing himself as an author, and he wrote The Architecture Verb, also sort of making fun a little bit of the language you use, hence we need a new language. But I would say I'm more of a Cedric Price girl than a Johanna Friedman, but of course we can see that it's not about taste, but it's just to say that maybe talking back to the point of the 70s, I would say that we are now at a point where we can actually do it, right? We have the technology, we have the connectivity, we have the media, and I would say we have the political and cultural climate where people are maybe getting a bit fed up. And I think we're to be spiritual, I think we're going to head towards an existential crisis, if in all honesty. And that might just be the leverage we need in order for people to collaborate and to work. And there the person and the practice, like our profession and the personal life, might start to merge a little bit more. I don't know, I'm sorry.
Ultima domanda?
The question about the small group.
I would just repeat what you said. But when I heard local communities and small groups, I instinctively thought, well, think big. I mean, electrification, the railroad system, the road grid, and the internet, the public health system. These are not local groups. These are worldwide. So maybe, if and when possible, but think big.
No, in fact.
But maybe I'm not provocating, or I always think that the two worlds need to sort of top down needs to meet bottom up in a productive manner. I mean, we use these sentences very easily, but what actually does that mean? And right? I mean,
because top-down kind of solutions haven't worked so far, and that's why, to go back to your question, engineers and scientists are not longer able to solve the problems with working in small groups, right? But to take a decision that will be then top-down, imposed to everyone, we are not in this kind of technocratic regime precisely because of the complexity of the problems, because they are so closely related to local ecologies, to the small group question. An ecological problem cannot be resolved by the expert, the scientist expert, and the engineer working on that specific niche problem, but it will involve also landowners, NGOs, local anthropologists, local communities, so all those who have
local sharing.
Yeah, all those, not just the community, but those who have relevant knowledge about the ecological problem, let's say the farmers or ornithologists, if it's a very specific. So those who who work there on a daily basis. On the other hand, we have the scientists who have the expertise and the engineers who have the technologies. Plus, we need to sensibilize the local communities to the problem, but mobilizing all sorts of practical knowledge without eliminating anyone. I think that's regardless the scale, that's the solution, perhaps, where we'll have to, of course, to have all sorts of disciplines joining together with the local people who have the relevant knowledge of chemical cycles, changing seasons, the species they live with because they're part of their world, their daily kind of world, but also their mythologies, their culture, and everything goes from there. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you very much, Albena Janeva, Saskia van Stein, and you all for coming here. Grazie, buonasera.